Well, hey guys, in this video we'll be discussing a little bit of the background of A Christmas Carol and Charles Dickens, as well as talking about Stave I. I had some videos that I made several years ago that covered all the staves, but unfortunately I can't seem to find them, they disappeared. So I'm going to redo this, and hopefully they're just as good. Um, so let's talk about Charles Dickens first. Dickens is one of the most celebrated writers in literature, well known for his works like, you know, Christmas Carol, right? And then Oliver Twist, A Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, amongst a lot of others. But specifically with A Christmas Carol, this Dickens wrote this and had it published in about 6 weeks, which for the time, even today, is pretty astronomical. I mean, that's just incredible. And he wanted to make sure that he didn't charge a lot for it. And if I remember correctly, he actually was self-published it and took a risk, but it made a lot of money and it sold out several thousand copies in just a couple of days. They had to do a second, a third, and a fourth printing. Christmas Carol was that popular. And what it did was it struck a tone with a lot of people in England at that time, and then into the United States, where he was well respected as well, um, because it brought back a lot of the traditions, the remembrances of the traditions that people in Victorian England had at that time. Um, in the 1840, early 1840s, and that was brought back traditions such as having, Christmas dinner, giving gifts and cards, having a Christmas tree, putting up wreaths and holly and things like that. Really wasn't done a lot. And then because of Dickens and his and A Christmas Carol, it kind of brought back a lot of those a lot of the traditions that a lot of people in America, people who celebrate Christmas, still have today. But Dickens drew a lot from his past as a child. We know that um, his father misspent a lot of their money, and they ended up in debtor's prison. So when Charles was about 11 or 12, he had to, go to work while his parents were in prison because they owed money they couldn't pay back. He went to work in a blacking factory, which is where they make, what they call boot black in England, or boot polish. In those days, the working conditions were pretty terrible. Charles would probably work 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, making very little money, pasting, he pasted labels on the bottles of boot polish. So, not the greatest of situation to be in for a young child. Um, and I guess that's where he kind of learned what it was like to be part of the working poor, what it was like to be in that situation. And it always made him very sensitive to the plight of many poor people, which you can kind of see in Bob Cratchit, who is Scrooge's clerk. So the book did very well when it was first published. It's been made into countless movies. Everybody from Disney to Mickey Mouse has done it. You've had the Muppets make A Christmas Carol, Veggie Tales, and all kinds. I mean, all different kind of versions of it. And so it's really a classic. And even today, I've read it. I don't know how many times. I always come away with something, learning something new from it, and enjoy it every year. So let's talk about Stave I. Now we talked a little bit about Dickens in the background. Let's talk about Stave I. So in Stave I, we're introduced to, well, we're told from the very beginning that Marley is dead. That's what he starts with, right? Marley was dead to begin with, and he tells us about 3 or 4 times in that first couple of pages that Marley was dead. And the reason why Dickens does that is to make sure that we know he's dead, because as he says, if you don't know that Marley was dead, there's then nothing wonderful, can come out of the story I'm about to relate. So you have to know that he's dead. So when he appears later in Stave II, you're kind of like, hey, that guy's dead, right? So it was important that we know he was dead. And we're introduced to Scrooge, um, and he's nasty, mean. I mean, he's described as a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, secret and self-contained. He's very much about himself. Now Scrooge is we're not quite, doesn't really describe what Scrooge does for a living, but we know he probably has something to do with money lending, loaning out money, probably owning properties. In some versions, he's a landowner or a sort of landowner. He owns a little, the tenements that people live in and properties, and people pay him rent. So the landlord. And never really says what he does, and I guess it doesn't really matter. But we're introduced to him, and it talks about just how mean he is. That nobody will talk to him. Nobody will ask him what time it is on the street. Nobody will ask him, how to get to such and such a place. The dogs in the street avoid him. The beggars avoid him. They don't want to have contact with Scrooge. And so that's how but as it says, that's what he wanted. That was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded walks of life, crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance. Stay away from me. I do my thing. You do yours. Don't get in my way. And in the first scene that we have with Scrooge, he's working, and his nephew Fred comes in. Now, Fred is interesting because he's the only living relative that Scrooge has. That's it, from his sister. And he treats him like dirt. He comes to basically wish him a Merry Christmas. Of course, that's when we get the famous bah humbug. Humbug meaning thing that's pretty much useless, not worth your time, just trashy. Don't need it. So he calls Christmas a humbug. And of course, Fred's taken aback by that, right? He wonders why Christmas is a humbug. You don't mean that, And he says, of course you do. Of course I do. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills with no money, a time for balancing your book and finding, every account presented debt against you, finding yourself a year older, another hour richer, and so forth and so on. So basically, he says, if I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. And that's how he feels about it. Of course, Fred is appalled by this, and then gives a speech about what Christmas has done for him, and that's that even though it's put a scrap of gold, and it's never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good and will do me good, and I say God bless it. Fred's is the antithesis, or what we call character foils. They're exact opposites. Scrooge is mean, nasty, he's a misanthrope, he hates all of mankind. Fred, on the other hand, is genial and amiable and warm and welcoming. And he says that, and so they balance each other as character foils. But Fred, he talks about what Christmas time is. It's a time for, it's a good time. It's when men treat each other with respect more, and they seem to be nicer to each other and see each other as human beings and not just as people going on different journeys. Of course, Scrooge isn't buying any of that, and eventually Fred basically just says, "Look, I don't want anything from you. I'm not asking anything of you. Why can't we be friends?" And Scrooge just keeps telling him good afternoon. There's a point where Scrooge asks him about why he got married, and Fred says, "Well, because I fell in love." And he says, "Well, that's the single thing more worthless than a Merry Christmas." You find out later why he would say that. And so Fred, wishes him a Merry Christmas on his way, and then we have two charity men that come in after that, right? And they ask Scrooge they're looking for donations. Of course, Scrooge wants nothing to do with them, and he asks them if there's, talking about helping the poor out, and Scrooge doesn't believe he needs to help idle people. Scrooge thinks poor people are poor because they're idle, because they do nothing. Now, in some cases that's true, but in a lot of cases that's not. There are people who just, need extra help, or, don't have the skills necessary to make a better living. And so that's what Scrooge thinks. So the men are appalled at his behavior, because he asks, well, aren't there prisons? Aren't there workhouses? Aren't there, these poorhouses that people could go to? And he's like, well, yeah, they are, but they're full, and a lot of people don't want to go there. They don't want to go to these places. They're awful. They'd rather die than go there. And of course, Scrooge says, well, if they'd rather die, then let them do it and decrease the surplus population. So just a horrible thing for the man to say, that he'd rather these people just die and bring down the extra surplus of people that they don't need. Just pretty nasty. The men leave in disgust, and then Scrooge goes home. And of course, the famous scene where he starts to put the key in the lock, and the way Dickens describes it, and there's his old business partner, Jacob Marley, his face in the door knocker. And it doesn't say boo, it just stares at him, and his eyes are wide open, his hair is moving, and just looks at him. And then Scrooge, as he kind of kind of refocuses, it's gone. So he's not sure what he saw. Maybe he just disagreed with him. And so he goes in and goes upstairs and lights his candle. Of course, it's really dark because, as it says, darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. So Scrooge liked the darkness because it's cheap. You don't have to pay for it. So he goes to his room. He locks himself in after checking through some of the rooms, right? And at that point, he takes his gruel, okay, from the hob, and as he sits back, he notices there's a bell in the room that begins to swing, and then it starts swinging and starts shaking, and it starts to ring, and then all the bells in the house start to ring. These pull cords for the servants and things like that. And about that time, he hears these chains being dragged, and he remembers that he was told that ghosts drag chains with them sometimes, right? So he hears that, and as he's stunned to see this phantom, this specter ghost walk through the door, and he doesn't recognize him at first, but he asks him who are you? And he's like, asked me who I was. He says, well, who were you? He's like, well, in life I was your partner, Jacob Marley. So Marley shows up, and he's not sure if he can sit down because he's a ghost. So he says, well, in typical British fashion, wants him to sit down, and he says, well, I can. Marley says he can take a chair, so he sits down, and he's covered in this giant chain, and on it there are ledgers and deeds and cash boxes and all these different things that deal with his trade, money lending and things like that. So as the conversation goes on, he finds out that Marley is doomed to wander the earth, right? He's doomed to do that because he never went out among his fellow man. He never did anything to help anybody else. He was always concerned about numero uno, just about himself. And he talks to Scrooge about this. Of course, Scrooge thinks he's hallucinating. Scrooge thinks that he himself is actually hallucinating. And he thinks it's because he ate something bad, because people at that time believed if you ate some bad food, it would give you nightmares or hallucinations. He says, you might be a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato, right? He says, there's more of gravy than a grave about you, whatever you are. And of course, at that point, Marley gets enraged and jumps and screams and shakes his chains, and it shows Scrooge that he's not fooling around, right? So, Marley tells him why he's there, and he's telling him that the reason why he's in this position is because he never went out and helped people, that mankind should have been his business. So he tells Scrooge that he has a chance and hope of avoiding Marley's fate, and he says, you'll be haunted by 3 spirits. Of course, Scrooge, in typical Scrooge fashion, asked if he could get them all at once and get it over with. And in fact, at first he said, I think I'd rather not, but without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread, is what Marley tells him. And he tells him that they'll come tonight when the bell tolls 1, and then the last one will come as the last stroke of 12, actually midnight hits the hour. And so as he's walking out, though, as he's starting to move towards the window, he motions for Scrooge to come. And he points out the window, and this is when Scrooge sees all these ghosts and spirits. They're all chained up, and they're wailing and they're crying, and they're full of remorse, and they didn't do enough with their lives to avoid this fate. And Scrooge sees, as he observes, that the misery of each phantom was that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. They lost the power to help. They should have done it while they were in the flesh, right? So he sees that, and they all kind of faded together, and the night became as it had been, before he went to bed. So and then of course Scrooge, he kind of just blows it off, and he's not sure quite what he saw, but he just thinks it's something that he ate, right? Okay, and he just kind of crawls into bed and collapses. And that pretty much ends Stave 1. So the important things, you got Marley's visit that warns him and tells him he has a chance. We see Scrooge in all his disgusting, horrible, misanthropic glory. But the question you have to ask yourself is, how does a person get to that situation? How do you become like that? Because it doesn't happen overnight, right? So those questions you have to ask. Why is he that way? And Dickens does a great job with the way he describes and explains things. To really give you a good idea of how bad Scrooge really is. And the one thing I guess I left out was the part about was a section about Bob Cratchit asking for Christmas Day off, which he normally gets with pay, and of course Scrooge is angry about having to pay Cratchit for no work to be done. So kind of missed that part, and that's important. But you know, and Bob's happy to have the day off because this would be the one day out of the year that he would get off for work and still be paid. So it's Christmas Day. So that's pretty much Stave 1 in a nutshell, and encourage you to go back and take a look through the sections. Okay, bye.